So there's really a lot that goes into this whole notion of preparedness and securing your supply network.
Linked to that, what we see is that linked to the tsunami and Fukushima disaster, we see that a lot of our clients were suffering from sub-tier suppliers who are not able to supply their suppliers anymore. So it's important to identify your suppliers and see where they are located. Like a lot of French automotive companies had to stop their supply chain because their sub-tier supplier was based close to Fukushima. Mm-hmm. So it's important to identify everything that goes beyond the direct supplier and see how they are supplying or how they are getting their goods to make sure that they can continue their production line, to make sure that they continue ship your goods. So that's increasingly important.
Thank you very much. So let's continue asking Greg this question. What would you say the major supply chain risks that your organization faces?
Well, we really have 3 or 4 significant risks depending on the market. If we're talking about supplying a system of equipment to an offshore rig, usually an offshore rig is something that's governmental sponsored. The Norwegian government might sponsor, Brazilian government might sponsor a large program where you might have 7 years in the supply of that vessel. You have to, the field negotiations, the leases, designing the equipment, building the equipment. That could be a process of many years. So in that case, the risks are that if we're selling a suite of equipment that's undefined, then we have to engineer that suite of equipment. And if it goes into items with very long lead times, then we have to do a lot of pre-releases based on the best engineering information you have at the time in order to get that large piece of equipment there when you need it.
Given the technological or engineering uncertainty, do you still have to commit to a certain kind of a delivery date?
Generally, yes. We have all kinds of language in our contracts that say subject to prior sale, after receipt of order. But in the minds of our customers, not always the oil companies, but in many cases they're putting the pressure on the drilling contractors. And that drilling contractor has a contract beginning October the 1st for $700,000 a day for 3 years. If they can't fulfill that contract within a short period of time, the oil company is going to cancel that contract and they're going to go to another provider. And that's a huge amount of investment. You can imagine a $1 billion drill ship earning $700,000 a day for 3 or 5 years. You want that contract if you've spent that $1 billion. So it could be a substantial risk, and we might be designing something that has a lead time of 18 months, and we might be a year or 2 into this cycle before we know enough about that to even order raw materials. So if something happens to disrupt that raw material, we're dead in the water. We have to figure out how to design workarounds. So that's one type of risk. The other type of risk is in an unforeseen market condition, where last year at this time, we saw very little activity in land drilling. So we have a lot of products that cover this whole spectrum, but very little activity. And we actually built our annual forecast on a very small number of land drilling rigs, land drilling equipment. And by the end of the year, we already had orders in place for this year that were twice as many as we had predicted and set our staffing and set our supply chains to support. And now that number has increased even more. So we have a facility in Houston that delivered 1 rig every two months, and now we're building up our capabilities for 5 rigs a month out of the same facility. And we have to be able to consummate that transaction within the next 6 months or so, or we'll miss that market opportunity. So there certainly could be market-driven things. The technology of products, customers making changes along the way, saying, I really don't want that anymore, I want this now. And once again, the dates are not moving because the owner of the lease is still wanting to start drilling and start producing because they've laid out a tremendous amount of money. So
given the technological or engineering-wise uncertainty, though, I wonder if there are ways or mechanisms to share this kind of risk between not just, it sounds to me like you are bearing the risk and then your client not. Is there a way to kind of share this risk among each other's yourselves?
You do in a way because it has to do with pricing.
Oh, I see.
If you're taking an enormous risk and you have a lot of unknowns,
Price tag is going to be high.
You use your past experiences in similar equipment, and you say, well, that's going to be 50,000 engineering hours, and it's going to be $200 million in materials. Well, then in many cases we will actually get down payments from the customer.
I see.
That will be even up to as much as 75% of that up front in order to get their stake in the game.
I see.
But there's still a risk in us not being able to achieve our objective. We haven't failed to achieve it, but it's always a possibility.
And I'd add to that, and I'd say that it starts with prior. So in the Army we call it the 7 Ps, right? Prior proper planning prevents piss poor performance, right? And so if we want to be a little bit more, proper in the way we would say that, I'd call it today, in the oil company we'd call it scope of work, right? And so if you do your planning correctly and you do your scope of work correctly, then you're going to have less change orders, or you're going to have less management of change, so what we call MOCs, right? Because if I'm going to change the way that I'm going to do the job, I've got to notify all along the chain, right? I mean, we've got to go back to our contractors so that they know that the job has changed, and we know that if we don't do the planning, the proper amount of planning ahead of time, that's going to cost us more money.
Okay, shall we then ask now Sander to talk about maybe his...
We have a question.
Oh, there's a question?
We're in an unstable environment right now, and regarding the oil industry, planned disasters, shall we say. I followed the news directly last night. A couple of oil refineries in the Middle East were bombed and taken out. It's going to take decades to rebuild. But are the companies notified ahead of time so they can either evacuate employees? And I realize it's a military sensitive question, but are you generally informed of a military action ahead of time?
I've personally not encountered that, but maybe Carlos has.
So I've lived or worked in 69 different countries, and I have not had. So you'll get something perhaps from the embassy saying all American citizens should consider leaving the state or the country, or they but you won't get we would not get. I've not been a party to a conversation or a prior warning that a target's going to be hit.
Regarding your employees on that side?
Well, fortunately, I haven't had the U.S. government target our facilities or locations, so. No.
It is an unpopular industry, however.
It is an unpopular, especially, yes.
So let's ask Sander to talk about his version of the supply chain risk. Maybe not his own, but then probably his clients.
Yeah, sure. So what we see is a growing complexity of supply chain. Many companies have changed from a source local to a source anywhere and build anywhere model. So that means that instead of knowing the regulations and the companies that are just around the corner, all of a sudden you have to know about the regulations and reputation in, well, basically any country in the world. We have seen you have global companies. So how do you deal with that? Maybe assessing financial formats. I mean, not everybody is publishing in IFRS formats. I don't know about your Polish, but mine sucks and I can't read the Polish financial account. So how do you deal with that? So as many suppliers can bring you a lot of value and help you to grow your company and help you to, well, bring expertise into your company. But if they are client-facing and if they are not managed adequately, they can harm and damage your company on the reputational side and on the financial stability of your company. So what our clients want to do is and I take out 3 examples, is basically manage their reputation. I mean, do you know who you're actually buying from? Who's that company? Who's the direct owner? Who's the global ultimate owner? And further on, who's the beneficial owner? I mean, it's possible that you work with a company like Mediaset in Italy, and they are in the media industry. Do you know that Silvio Berlusconi is the beneficial owner of that? You will not see this in the financial statements. So in many countries, it's very important to know if this company is indirectly state-owned, or if one of the beneficial owners is a PAP, a politically exposed person. That's really important, because if something happens with these companies, they can harm your reputation tremendously. Again, linked to sub-tier supplier management, we have the example in Bangladesh where a lot of clothing factories have, well, a damaged reputation because of the labor industry and the labor conditions in Bangladesh. So this is something that you would like to know beforehand, if possible, and if it happens, that you can react timely and as fast as possible. Now, the second example is what people want to do is do a financial risk analysis. I mean, it could be possible that your supplier is financially stable, but are you sure that the complete corporate structure is financially stable? A little example, what one of our clients has done, I think 2 years and a half ago, is they have sent their strategic suppliers to the credit department. And they said, look, imagine these 500 companies are clients and they're requesting for a credit limit. Would we actually provide a credit limit to that company? And if the answer is, well, maybe, well, we prefer cash terms, are you then sure that this company is providing you the best goods at the best price? And if they do today, are you then sure they will be capable to do this next year or the year after? I mean, if they are financially unstable, they will not be able to get the right credit limits from their suppliers. So basically the cost of producing for them is a lot higher than for a competitor which is financially stable. Yeah. And the third example is linked to the corporate family tree. Who of you is calculating your dependency on suppliers? Nobody. Oh, we have a lot of prospects here. So the idea is, I mean, if you are buying goods, let's say 1 million from one specific company on an annual basis, and that company has an operating revenue of 2 million, then they are really dependent on you. Imagine you would decrease from 1 million to 750, that will affect tremendously their profit margin, yeah, and basically could ruin the stability of that specific company. The other way around, if you, well, buy 10 times 1 million from 10 different companies, do you then know that they are linked to one another? That your, well, total dependency is 10 million instead of 10 times 1 million? I mean, if this company is unstable, or if this company will be bought by another company, if there is a rumor on M&A transactions, then you want to know that these companies are linked, because all of a sudden there is 10 million moving to probably a competitor who's buying your best supplier. Yeah. To give you one example, we had a company based in New York who was, well, putting a lot of pressure on the price of price per unit of one of their, well, smaller suppliers, and that smaller supplier really didn't like it. Surprise. So what they did is they went to their global ultimate owner and said, look, we don't like the way they are handling us, and we don't want to continue with them. The global ultimate owner said, look, you know what, we are also supplying goods. So they both went back to that company and said, look, if you continue to handle or treat us in that way, we're not supplying anymore to you. And in the end, they stopped the complete supplying goods. For the small company, that was not too bad, but the global ultimate owner was a really strategic supplier for that company. And all of a sudden, they had to search for an alternative. Surprise for them. Yeah. So it's really important to know the financial stability, to know if a company can harm your reputation, and to know how these different suppliers are linked to one another, to know your, well, exposure to risk on a corporate family level.
And these intelligence are not public information, are they?
They are. Well, in the United States, nobody has to publish financials. In Europe, basically everybody has to publish financials. Sole traders don't have to do that, but who's having a sole trader as supplier? So that means that there is a lot of information out there that you can use. Internally, you have a lot of information as well. Sometimes unstructured, like mentioned before in the keynote session. But if you would go into your country and go to your decentralized units to see what kind of information you would have, you would be surprised how much you know about all these different suppliers. And now the trick is to get all that information standardized and to get it all into one tool to make sure that you as a manager has a clear view on where is your risk globally. And technology today can do that. It's just a matter of starting the process, and then you can go to identifying where are the possible risks. Is this a sole source, or do you have multiple sources? And if that sole source is bankrupt or stopped supplying, what is the impact? So you can measure what is a possible impact on your company. And based on that, then it's your job, then you have to mitigate that risk. Try to find alternative, try to, well, create a risk-based pricing, and continue to monitor what's going on with your supplier base. So the first thing is getting all that information you have currently in your company, put it all together and get the clear view, identify the risk classes and work on that.
So some companies, go ahead.
I work at Sempra U.S. Gas and Power down in San Diego, and we've just and I work in the procurement department, and we've just implemented this supplier risk program, where we calculate each of the different facets of supplier risk, risk associated with suppliers. The biggest issue that we encountered while calculating financial risk was for these smaller private companies, we didn't have enough information. We didn't have any information. And for most companies, those small private companies, they occupy a major chunk of your entire supply base. How, in your experience, how have you tackled with that?
Most companies immediately contact their suppliers and asking for these financials. And we see, well, like 5 years ago, and certainly like in companies and countries like Germany, people were very reluctant to provide these financials. But just like, I mean, it wasn't a keynote session. Everybody's sharing everything on Facebook. Yeah. And maybe the older generation is a bit reluctant to that, but younger generation find it really normal to share things. Not only their private photos, but also financial data, because they want to sell the goods. I mean, they want to become your supplier. And if you as a company say, look, we have this kind of policy and we want to treat our suppliers in the same way, and therefore we need some financial indicators, preferably audited financials, can you give me an indicator on how stable you are? Because we don't want to get these surprises. And we see an increasing number of companies are actually doing this. So it's a matter of, well, identifying where do you have the financials, where do you not have financials, and then sending out mails or contact these people saying, look, we need that data. And then you need technology in-house to capture that data, save it, and make it centrally available for everybody, just to make sure that not 2-3 people are asking 3 times the same financial data.
Do you follow any methodology or a checklist when you do an assessment of the supplier?
The answer is yes and no. Well, I mean, there is no standardized way on how to identify risk, and there is no standardized checklist that apply to every company. So, well, you have some chapters that you have to check, like financial statements, reputational risk, compliance to local regulations, corporate family risk, and so on. But it's really important to be flexible in there, because, I mean, the exposure to risk is universal, but how companies are dealing with that risk could be unique. So, I mean, for me, it's just a matter of being flexible, make sure we try to understand what is their internal checklist, and then make sure that we can, well, work with that checklist and provide the proper solutions for that. So it's difficult to answer that question, because the big chapters are common for everybody, but how you would deal with it and maybe the sub-chapters are really dependent on the specific company and how your supply base is structured. Yeah.
What is being done relative to leadership succession planning? So we can talk about financials and all sorts of stuff. But
Yeah.
You've got one leader. What do you guys do in that particular space?
That's a
How
good
do you
question.
assess that?
That's a good question. Some financial accounts provide a list of, well, directors and leaders, CEOs. And some of the accounts, well, in some countries, people have to publish when they change, well, a board member or when they have a new CEO in place. And in some cases, the date of birth is added to that. It's very specific and it's not globally accepted, but some countries do. That means that if you find a leader who's 88, I hope that he will live for 20 years longer. But then you have to identify, well, what happens? Is he the sole owner of that company? And what about his sons? Are they capable to take over when it happens? So that's a very, very specific question. In some countries we can answer to that, and in most countries we can't. And that's why it's important to, well, to make sure in your company that you are aware of that, and you ask that questions to the key people who are dealing with that supplier. And that's a kind of a questionnaire, a kind of a checklist that you could ask. Who's the leader? Is he driving a Porsche or a Ferrari? Who is he paying, or how is he paying for that? And what is his age? And what happens if he stops? And that's the questionnaire you have to, well, that's something unique that you have to make sure you have it in your checklist.
I'd say in probably our industry on the oil and gas side, it's a lot harder to get engineers to want to move out to California. And, I've experienced the opportunity to live in Texas, and, I love Texas, and I hear a lot of those guys, as I remember in college, having some of those guys get up and say, everything's bigger and better in Texas. And those guys don't want to leave Texas. And so we're actually working very closely together with different universities, to include USC and the Cal State University system, to work with their engineering departments so that we can get homegrown talent here in California. And, I can say probably over the last 5-6 years, California was a place where the younger individuals, at least at Occidental, were coming and getting a lot more experience than they otherwise would have in the Permian Basin. And so, in a company that you had an average age of, I'm not going to say it, but let's say in the mid-50s, okay, the average age in California was younger. And so people, the younger folks wanted to come to California because they would get opportunities here they wouldn't otherwise get in other parts of the company. And, I can think of some of the younger kids that, I remember seeing them walk in the door, and today they're standing up, giving presentations, and they're taking on management positions today. And it's just great to see. And so that's kind of what we're doing, from that perspective, give folks an opportunity, provide the training, partner with universities to make sure that the programs are tailored to the types of jobs we're trying to fill.
I'd like to add a little bit to it in terms of succession planning, and we're an acquisitive company. We've acquired 250 companies in the last 15 years, and so as a result, there's not a cohesive company style or strategy. And we're moving more toward that in the last couple of years, putting in things like assessments of your employees, their promotability of the employees, development program for the employees, and where do you expect them to go based on their potential, and using a matrix format to look at that. The other thing that the company does is fairly unique. It has what's called a Next Gen program, which actually brings in between 50 and 100 students directly out of college each year, and places them in one of 4 locations, each for 3 months at a time. They could be anywhere in the world, working in any part of the company, and then drafting them into their home, if you will, at that point in time. But a lot of effort is put into feeding that, because our demographics are probably not unlike Carlos in the sense that we have a very thin layer of highly experienced older people, dinosaurs, and we have a large demographic of young, inexperienced people, but not a lot in between.
I wanted to ask Sander, from a layperson's perspective, right? So if I'm trying to figure out who is the best supplier potentially, then probably I can go ask you to give me the financial data and how stable they are, and then pick the best one out of 5, let's say. But then if you're talking about, something happens, let's say earthquake happens in Britain, and I have no idea, actually my supplier is actually affected, so I will be affected, not now, but in 3 months. Can you alert me, or can you tell me before I know it?
Before you know it, yes. Before it happens, no.
Okay. How does it happen though? Is there some kind of a dashboard or something?
Well,
you just beep, 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 or?
It's more like that, yeah. But we use a red flag instead of a beep. I'm dealing now with a great company based in Boston, and they read on a daily basis 100 million articles published. So if something happens in Great Britain, I've never heard about an earthquake in Great Britain, but it could happen, then it's probably published somewhere, and quite fast. I mean, on Twitter it will be in a few seconds, in the Daily Telegraph maybe the day after.
But I don't know whether my supplier is actually there. I don't know. I know my supplier.
That's one of your checklists that you need to put in place. What we see for large companies now is that one of the terms and conditions that they send out to their suppliers is that they have to, publish their suppliers. And like for big companies like IBM, they can only work with sub-tier suppliers if they are approved by IBM. So in that case, that's one of your checklists. That's one of the analysis that you have to do. And then if something happens, you need to have the tools or a web crawler that identifies immediately there is a natural disaster there, a link to one of your companies in your supplier base, and then you get the beep beep going on.
So who is get alerted? A procurement manager or?
It depends on who you are linking with that specific company.
okay.
So it could be one of your buyers, it could be a category manager. You could send it to your CEO as well if it is a really important supplier.
I see, very interesting. Okay, thank you. So let's ask Parag from his perspective as charity, what kind of supply chain risk that he is facing, please.
We work essentially into rural electrification. There are a couple of risks that we identify, is one from the demand side and others from the operational side. And when we're talking about operational side, is basically sourcing out your products, timely deliveries, installation of the products, and especially we are working in decentralized power. So the areas there is no accessibility, there are no roads. Getting your systems out there is a challenge. Implementation, human resources, technical resources, and also strain on the financial resources with regards to your installation. So those are the challenges that we grapple with. One of the key issues, like one of the projects that we conducted right now, is installation of roughly around 10,000 home lighting systems in parts of India, and this was spread over 25 different states. So the whole objective was like, how do we work on this to ensure that everything goes in time, and we do it in the time frame that we ensure, on the timelines that we are put in. And what we did ensure is, like, we got one of the best logistics company, which is Blue Dart and DHL, to partner with us to ensure that this happens. And on the flip side, one of the key issues was sourcing of the products. Now, for every product that we have, we had 5 different suppliers, and 5 different suppliers coming from 5 different countries, and to ensure that everything comes on time and to ensure that everything is assembled to the fact that it goes down in one piece was a challenge in itself. Initially, we grappled with it. It took us, for the first 2,000 systems, it took us like 6 months to deploy it. And basically, we had to rework the entire strategy. We got in touch with a global company which was really good at assembling those units and mitigating our risk of handling 5 different suppliers in each category. So rather than handling 20 different suppliers, what we did is we were handling only 2 companies, which is one from France and one from Germany, who on our behalf were doing the hard work and getting things done. And I'm proud to say, actually, for the balance of the systems that we did, it just took us 12 days later on to install it. So our learning curve has been quite a bit on that. And now we are actually working with the government of India on a much more comprehensive policy that in next 5 to 7 years, basically, we want to ensure that for all the progress that our country's made, there are 200 million people without basic access to electricity. And we're just ensuring that in 5 to 7 years, we see to it that not a single home out there lacks electricity. And that's the whole objective of doing what we are doing. The same things we are taking up in Africa. We have just done a pilot project across in Africa. Similar challenges, installation, capacity building, geopolitical risks as well.